Hello and welcome to this lecture 8, which is titled as The Rise of New Left and its Cultural Interests. And this lecture is being delivered under this SWAYAM course titled Aspects of Cultural Studies. In today's lecture, we will discuss how the new leftists emerged against the insufficiencies or the silences of the old Marxists. We will also discuss the new times during which the new leftists arose and the new leftist agenda, as well as their connections with the necessity of organic intellectuals or organic intellectualism, which was propounded by Antonio Gramsci and which the British new leftists would heavily borrow from. So, as you might have come to know about how the old Marxists were following a more revolutionary, sudden, violent, disciplinary approaches to study communism or to study the social events, social issues, and how their approach of historical materialism, that is to look at culture only from the perspective of wealth, money or matter, how there were insufficiencies of their methodology to bring in change through revolution, how all these would shape the time for the birth of the new leftists and their agendas to bring in social change in society, and thereby the birth of organic intellectuals. So, this we will discuss in today's lecture, and I am sure you will understand it better if I take you to the slide that is on your screen. Okay. So, there were problems with the Marxism which the new leftists were trying to point at, and those problems were problems of great insufficiencies in terms of their passion, interest and methodologies, and obviously their intellectual or discursive silences, as well as the great evasions of the world problems. So, the new leftists would criticize the old Marxists for being silent, for evading and for being insufficient in looking at the emerging world problems, which we have already spoken in our previous lecture. And then the Marx, they also criticize, the new leftists also criticize that Marx did not undertake or seem to understand what were the privileged object of study. To simplify, Marx did not look at culture, ideology, language and the symbolic interactions and other things, the intangible things, while decoding or while discoursing on culture. His emphasis was purely on the wealth or the what is called historical materialism, and that was reductionist in nature. And his historical determinism was centered on the idea of antagonism or struggle, which is called class struggles, the binary between the bourgeois and the proletariats, and that is how it would become, it tried to be a meta narrative for all kinds of discourses including culture. Something like Raymond Williams would talk about borrowing the Marxist ideology principle called base and superstructure. Anyway, but there are so many things which could not be ascertained or discoursed or analyzed purely from the perspective of matter or money. So, that was the problem the new leftists tried to pose in front of the intellectuals. Not only that, Stuart Hall, one of the new leftists, Stuart Hall would question Marxist idea that capitalism evolved organically from within its transformations. This is what the Marxist ideology believed, that capitalism is an emergence from within its formations, or it is a transformative nature of class struggles. A class struggle based on bourgeois and proletariats, or haves of property or have-nots of property. Stuart Hall challenges this, and thereby he would challenge the historical determinism also. He says, but capitalism in Jamaica, where Stuart Hall was from, imposed by colonization, not by money. Marxism therefore bears Eurocentric definition. So, this Eurocentric definition of Marxism was its stake, was being questioned. You can't define class struggles or culture or the social activity, social culture or social order purely from the perspective of matter or wealth. So, this was the problem for the new leftists. Again, Stuart Hall would borrow this idea, and he would talk about this in his second article called Cultural Studies and its Theoretical Legacies, published in 1992. He would say, Marxist theory suggested that capitalism evolved organically from within its own transformation, which we have talked about, whereas I came from a society where the profound integument of capitalist society, economy and culture, surrender of capitalist economy and culture had been imposed by conquest and colonization. So, you can't apply Marxism to all kinds of societies, and he is questioning about how Jamaica became capitalist not because of the money, but because of colonization and conquest. And that is how we also criticize in India how an agricultural country can be purely analyzed from the perspective of Marxism. This is a theoretical, not a vulgar critique that I am doing. Stuart Hall tells, I do not blame Marx because of where he was born. I am only questioning the theory for the model around which it is articulated, its Eurocentrism. So, this Eurocentric idea, this reductionist idea, this emphasis on historical materialism, these were the reasons for the birth of the new leftists, for a newer kind of Marxist method, and that the new leftist would evolve, learning the mistakes, the lacunas, the disadvantages of the Marxists, old Marxists. Now, this failure or inadequacies of Marxism was a point for the birth of the new leftists, but this was also coupled with the rise of new times, particularly in Britain, for the birth of new leftists. And these new times were basically the changes in the working class structure, the changes in people's personal private lives, family system, working class culture, people's choice, people's taste, multiculturalism. These were the difficult times, the changing contours of society and culture in 1950s that would mark what is called new times. And against these new times, they had to formulate the new agenda. By they, I mean the new leftists, particularly Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson. So, they would have new agenda towards a more democratic socialist kind of society. And that you will understand if I take you to the slide. You can see the slide on your screen. As you can see on your screen, the new times refers to the debate about the nature of social and cultural change in post-war Britain, an attempt to address the manifestation of breakup of traditional culture, something like, we are undergoing a lot of changes in our traditional culture back in India because of this computer industry and many other things. So, this was also part of the British society change, breakup of traditional culture in 1956, which is called New Times, especially the traditional class cultures, breakup of traditional class cultures, and this set about registering the impact of the new forms of affluence, new forms of comfort, new forms of luxury, new forms of lifestyles, as well as the development of a consumerist society or consumer society, much like our society now, on the very hierarchical and pyramidal structure of British society. We talk about the culture snobs, those who have money, those who have better taste in terms of capitalistic principles are higher in the scale of social hierarchy. Trying to come to terms with the fluidity and undermining impact of the mass media. So, mass media was a problem, and traditional culture, breakup of traditional culture was a problem, and this consumer society was a problem. So, how to tackle these problems were the concerns of the new leftists, and therefore, you have Macroby describing more about this New Times, and she says New Times refers to something of the diversity, not linear, similar, normal, one, homogeneous, but diversity of social and political upheavals in Britain, the decline of traditional working class politics and the emergence of a politics of identity. Remember, we were talking about body politics, concerning Marilyn Monroe, and consumption, and most importantly, the challenge these represent to the left. So, questions, concerns, demands about identities in terms of individual identity, in terms of race, color, creed, reason. So, identity was a big problem, as well as a mass society depending on mass culture of food, of dress, of technique, of communication, of many other things like that of ours. So, these were the new experiences, diversity, heterogeneous kinds, multiplying kinds of identities, cultures, classes that would emerge, and these were the problems for people to grapple with. So, who would grapple with? Obviously, though these were the problems of the public civic society or maybe political society, the state, but definitely it was supposed to be considered as the problems of the elites, the intellectuals, and this is where, unlike the leftists, old leftists, the new leftists would come in, barge in and take up these issues in their intellectual discourses in colleges, in universities. So, they had their own agenda, as you can see on your screen. What was the new left agenda, as you can read on your screen? They said, we are living through the proliferation, widespread of sites of power, power of politicians, power of industrialists, power of police, power of professors, power of producers, writers, sites of power and antagonism in modern society, and this politics of power and antagonism puts directly on the political agenda, the agenda of the new leftists. What was that agenda? The agenda was supposed to be the question of moral and intellectual leadership, not only political leadership, but now it is the moral and intellectual leadership, and obviously that would come from the intellectuals or the intellectuals in the universities. And not only the intellectuals, but the onus was also on educational curriculum, educative and formative role of the state. The state had to devise a kind of education that would take up or address or discourse on or educate people or students about newly emerging sites of power, culture, antagonism and other things. And obviously, the time was also symptomatic of trenches, fortifications of civil society by the political society, the state, and the crucial issue of the consent of the masses, and creation of a new type or level of civilization or new culture. And Antonio Gramsci talks about this concept of the proletariat, which the bourgeoistic class try to generate in the proletariat class, and that is how cultural hegemony or domination comes into the Gramscian discourse. So, this was the problem, and how these were to be addressed by the state, by the intellectuals, as well as by the educational curriculum. And remember, that is why you have Raymond Williams, and you have Stuart Hall, E.P. Thompson, Richard Hogarth. They would try to bring in changes in the methods of teaching in the curriculum, because they were part of the extramural teacher outside the university, teaching imparting adult education, and thereby they would be related to the outside world, outside a kind of different kind of students, adult students, who would come to be educated beyond the prescribed canonical university or college timetable. So, that was therefore the agenda for them to evolve a kind of new kind of education. And Thompson there would tell, and we have talked about this in our previous lecture, in his essay called Socialism and the Intellectuals, their agenda was a kind of socialist humanism. And for him, and I am quoting him, the new socialism involves projection of a utopian ideal of society, where labor, physical labor and culture are once again made personal, not owned by the state, and made significant for each individual, in which the life of the society is shaped not by pressures of the military or the corporation or the bureaucrat or the state, but by human brotherhood. So, this was then the New Left Times and the New Left agenda, and this would give birth to the New Leftists. So, I will take you to the slide to educate you about where did this New Left term come and who were the New Leftists. So, I will take you to the next slide. You can see on your slide. So, the term New Left appeared in the Journal of British New Left, first issue of Universities and Left Review. Let me tell you, this was one of the journals of the New Leftists. Again in 1957, you have the French contributor Claude Bourdieu's article, The French Left Long Run Trends. There he first used the word as a reference to the third way socialist movement that sought to occupy the space between communism and social democracy in Britain. Basically, you have the New Leftists were basically the third way between the established Labour Party in Britain and the Communist Party of Great Britain. However, the New Left term would be much popularized later on in 1960 by C. Wright Mills, who is known for his book Sociological Imagination in 1957, and the title of his letter was Letter to the New Left in 1960, which he wrote to this magazine. So, that is how you come to know about the origin or the genesis or the use or the popularization of this word called New Leftists. Nevertheless, who were they? The New Leftists were a cadre of Marxist historians in Britain, and they were an affiliation of scholars and intellectuals. What was their goal? Their goal was to create a space for socialist change, and the members were E.P. Thompson, John Saville, Raymond Williams, Charles Taylor, Barrett Brown, Ralph Miliband, Ralph Samuel, as well as Stuart Hall. And they would bring in these journals called New Reason and New Left Review, later on it would be named, and there they would publish articles, and you can see roughly 343 single authored pieces were published in this. So, that is how the New Leftists would stand from 1956 to 1960s, where there would be an end to New Leftist, again with a kind of dissatisfaction amongst themselves, the New Leftists. But then they had their objectives, and we are supposed to learn about precisely the objectives of these New Leftists, and that is what we will do in the next slide that I am sharing. So, you can look at at your screen to learn more about the objectives of the new leftists who try to tackle with or grapple with these problems. So, the first task the new left faced was chiefly intellectual task, that is creating an intellectual space for debating about the world affairs, and they were removed from the Stalinist dogmatism. Remember, Stalin's era was from 1928 to 1953, and he believed in the principle called all within the state, none outside the state and none against the state. So, he promoted a kind of totalitarianism, and the new leftists were basically against this concept of totalitarianism, where people would lose their individual freedom and choice, and people would rather be controlled, dictated by the state. So, the new leftists would oppose this aspect of Stalinist totalitarianism, and they also tried to develop a post-Stalinist Marxist philosophy and individual contributions of new left intellectuals on their respective fields of studies. So, historians, politicians, literators, people from literature, they would all, sociologists, they would all come together probably on a common platform and look into the problems from multiple perspectives, sometimes from interdisciplinary perspectives, or what is called transdisciplinary perspectives. So, that is how you have 1957 publication called The Uses of Literacy by Richard Hogarth, which would be sociological in nature, though the sociologists in the Birmingham University would discard it, saying that is not a kind of sociology that the sociologists do, right. But anyway, they would try to bring in these individual contributions of the new left intellectuals on the respective fields of study. And then they would also bring in Antonio Gramsci's idea of organic intellectuals, and Gramsci would appear in the new leftist magazine journal called New Reasoner, and particularly in an article written by Christopher Hill called Antonio Gramsci, and this is where they would learn the idea of organic intellectualism. And there was obviously these extreme shifts of the new left, that was a movement from the campus, universities, colleges to society, and then from society back to the campus. And this was in order to respond to the gap, hiatus between the expectations of the society and the actual conditions of contemporary times. So, therefore, new leftists such as Thompson and Raymond Williams would try to engage in the workers' education associations. Remember, they were the extramural teachers, extramural teachers. We will read more about their involvement in the next slide, and I am taking you to the next slide. So, you had Richard Hogarth, who hailed from a working class from Leeds in Britain, and he was not a university professor, but he was a teacher of adult working class students in what was called extramural department of the university. And that is how he was changing the nature of education, which the new leftists wanted to bring in order to grapple with the emerging new experiences. Similarly, you had Raymond Williams. He was son of a railway signalman, and he was from Wales, who was also teaching as an extramural tutor in the south of England, Wales, right. So, you have again somebody from the subaltern class and Richard Hogarth from the subaltern class, and they are dealing with the subaltern students, the adult students, and they were teaching as extramural teacher to impart adult education. Similarly, you had Edward P. Thompson, who was an extramural teacher again in Leeds, and Stuart Hall tells that I myself, that is Stuart Hall, he was from Jamaica and he was working as an extramural teacher in and around London. So, they were not the canonical teachers, or they were not the regular teachers, or the teachers that the society perceived as normal, college, university professors or university professors, but they were professors from the lowest rung of the society or from the subaltern class, and they would also involve with the subaltern class of students and with a new mode of education, that is extramural teaching or adult education, and that is how they will be connected with the subaltern classes, and they would therefore become evolve a kind of extramural critical pedagogy as we talk about. Now, I will take you to this slide to learn more about these contributions of the new leftists. So, you had Raymond Williams, who was not only a cultural critic as we are talking about, he was also a creative writer. You can see his novels here. So, he was a literator. At the same time, he was also a critic known for his Culture and Society, Long Revolution, Communication. You can see he was also writing on television, and obviously the keywords obviously, and then keywords already we have spoken about, Marxism and literature, politics, materialism and culture. So, they were a kind of experts in the field of culture, experts in civic affairs as well as university teaching. Similarly, you had Richard Hogarth, known for his book The Uses of Literacy, but he was also writing on teaching literature. Remember, I am emphasizing on education and educational curriculum, which was the concern of the cultural critics in BCCS in Birmingham. So, you have books like Teaching Literature, Higher Education and Cultural Change, which were focused on newer kind of education. You had books on culture, cultural studies, on culture and communication, that is mass culture, media and communication, and obviously on diversity and the universities. Obviously, he had other literary works as you can see on your screen. So, they were versatile scholars, free scholars who would try to grapple with not only canonical learning, but learning that were specific to the subaltern classes, working classes or the public. Similarly, you had E. P. Thompson, known for his book The Making of the English Working Class, where he gives this concept of history from below, and you see how this would be borrowed by the subaltern group back in India led by Ranajit Guha and others, talking about subaltern history of the marginals, the indigenous people, the people from lower caste, even the peasants who had their own methods of rebellion and therefore registering history, but they would never be included in the main Indian historiography. So, that is that subaltern groups philosophy of historiography, Indian historiography or subaltern historiography has connection with E. P. Thompson's idea of history from below, as you can see on your screen on this text called The Making of English Working Class. Obviously, he also spoke about studies in traditional popular culture, making history, the other side of medal. I think this was related with the 1857 Sepoy mutiny in India, and he was related to India. In fact, he taught in India, if I am not wrong, in West Bengal. Had book on reconstruction of India, a lot of books on Indian connection, right. Obviously, he had novels like Indian Day, Night Falls on Shiva's Hill, South India, A Farewell to India. This was probably a response to E. M. Foster's book probably, and then you have other texts. So, you can see from the bibliography how the new leftists were a body of scholars and intellectuals who had interests in diverse fields, literature, politics, history, administrations and many other domains of knowledges, and that is how they would harmonize or at least try to harmonize and evolve a center or an approach to social analysis called cultural studies. So, therefore, to understand cultural studies, you need to understand not only the world affairs, not only the old Marxists, but also the new leftists who would devise a method of cultural materialism as against the historical materialism of Marx. And by cultural materialism, they would talk about how culture is an instrument in the hands of the bourgeois for social control, for domination and hegemony, and Antonio Gramsci would talk about. So, this was all about the new left, and this is the references are in front of you. Probably you can look at the references and probably read more to learn more about the new leftists, their agendas and their objectives, and as well as their contributions, and your understanding of the new leftists would definitely enhance your understanding of the role of the new leftists as well as the role of cultural studies. So, with this we come to this to the end of this lecture 8 on new leftists, and which is part of the SWAYAM course called Aspects of Cultural Studies. And with this I thank you very much.